Burkina Faso just nationalized its gold mines, kicked out French troops, and signed a nuclear energy deal with Russia. This isn't a think tank simulation. This is happening, right now. But let's not be fooled. This isn't just a story about Africa making bold moves. It's about what happens when the so-called Global South stops asking for permission and starts making its own rules. And here's the part no one saw coming. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as just another aid-dependent state, is now building its own electric vehicles, processing its own gold, and quietly becoming the epicenter of a political earthquake. At the center of it all? A 36-year-old artillery captain, Ibrahim Traoré, who doesn't care about suits, protocol, or polite diplomacy. Quick question before we go further. Where are you watching from? Atlanta, Paris, Lagos, São Paulo? Drop it in the comments. And tell us, if your country suddenly kicked out all foreign troops, seized its gold, and told the West to sit down, would you cheer or worry? We want to know what you think, not the headlines. You're watching Legends by the Rivers, where we follow the rebellions, revolutions, and redirections of nations no longer waiting to be saved. This isn't charity. This is strategy. Let's go back to the beginning. Not when the world noticed, but when Burkina Faso decided it no longer cared if anyone did. The first flight of Air Burkina's relaunch wasn't delayed. That alone was news. But what truly raised eyebrows across boardrooms and bunkers alike was where it was going. Bamako. Not Paris, not Brussels. Bamako. A route once dismissed as irrelevant is now symbolic and, maybe, something more. For years, airports in landlocked African nations were more like exit wounds, places people left from, rarely returned to. They were designed to connect resource zones to foreign markets, not citizens to each other. So when a Burkina jet took off, flown by a local crew, purchased outright with no foreign debt, it wasn't just a departure, it was a declaration. The Embraer E190, 92 economy seats, 6 business, isn't a large aircraft by global standards, but in context, it might as well be a missile aimed at the old order, especially when that order once dictated who could fly, where, and why. Most Americans take air travel for granted, book, board, land. But in regions shaped by extraction and instability, mobility is political. It's the difference between waiting and arriving, between exile and return. When you control your own sky, you're no longer a subject of someone else's map. Still, it's easy to romanticize movement. The real challenge is sustaining it. That's where the twist lives. Air Burkina isn't profitable. Not yet. Fuel costs bite, maintenance is imported, and with each additional route, pressure mounts. But Traoré's government insists the airline isn't just a business, it's infrastructure. Strategic infrastructure. In Bobo Dioulasso, a sleepy second city turned test site, crews are racing to finish a new regional airport hub. 80 billion CFA invested into concrete, radar, terminals. On paper, it's logistics. But underneath, it's a message. We're not just reopening, we're repositioning. It's the kind of move that makes skeptics smirk. Africa building airports while people still go hungry? It's a fair question, but maybe it's worth asking something else too. What does it do to a population's spirit when their capital has no functional gateway to the world? According to behavioral studies on national morale, infrastructure tied to movement, trains, roads, flights, correlates more strongly with collective optimism than even GDP. In other words, people feel hope when they feel in motion. 2 years ago, most Burkinabe weren't thinking about flying. Today, they're watching their own aircraft lift off, piloted by their own, funded on their terms. Maybe that's not just economics. Maybe that's emotional engineering. And somewhere between the control tower and the customs line, a different question emerges. What happens to a landlocked country when it stops acting like one? The answer might not come from the runway, but it definitely starts there. A country launching an agro-offensive sounds like satire, until you realize the tractors are real, The budgets are approved and the targets are hectares, not enemies. But that's exactly what happened in early 24, when Burkina Faso's government rolled out a national farming campaign with the urgency of a military deployment. 78 billion CFA francs, hundreds of tractors, irrigation pumps, and farm kits, tens of thousands of tons in seeds and fertilizer, and a nationwide push to reverse decades of food dependency. On paper, it was agriculture. But the way it was announced, press conferences, press vests, even a central command, made it feel like wartime. Only this time, the battlefield was hunger. The strange part? It's working. Production has increased. Rural training programs are full. And in places like Banzon and Manga, locals speak of farming with pride, not just survival. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Most of the tools, tractors, motors, even the seed varieties, still come from abroad. Burkina Faso is feeding itself with foreign inputs. It's a paradox, a revolution in form, but not yet in foundation. Still, there's something else happening, something less measurable, but maybe more lasting. In the agro-civil training incubator near Barcé, students are handed 2 hectares of land, not a syllabus. They're taught with shovels, not slides. Some of them didn't finish high school, but they show up every day, early, covered in dust, laughing, planning. There's a shift, not just in output, in outlook. And that shift matters, because according to a Gallup Global Values survey, young adults who see clear local opportunity are 43% less likely to migrate, even when offered legal paths abroad. Americans, for example, often talk about pull factors, job markets, visas, freedom. But in much of the global South, it's push factors that dominate: poverty, frustration, disillusionment. So when a teenager in Burkina Faso says they'd rather farm than leave, that's not just a statistic, it's a signal. Of course, optimism isn't linear. There are still bottlenecks, limited storage, unreliable transport, unstable rain patterns. No policy fixes those overnight. But behavior? That changes faster than policy. A farmer who used to wait for government handouts now checks weather apps. A mother who once sold raw tomatoes on the roadside now delivers puree in bulk to a co-op. The product didn't change. The posture did. And if you've ever worked with people long enough, you'll know. When posture changes, possibility follows. So maybe this isn't a farming story after all. Maybe it's a story about time. And what happens when a country stops counting harvests in desperation and starts counting seasons in confidence? Somewhere in that shift, something begins to root. Not just in the soil, but in people. Most gold-rich countries don't look poor on paper. But then again, most of that gold isn't theirs once it leaves the ground. For decades, Burkina Faso exported raw ore while importing poverty. Gold was trucked out in armored convoys, processed elsewhere, and returned, if it returned at all, as revenue buried in offshore reports. The country dug, others cashed in. It wasn't just unjust, it was normalized. That changed in late 2024. 2 major gold mines, Bangu and Vagnan, were nationalized under Traoré's administration. The announcement wasn't framed as defiance, but as arithmetic. The government paid roughly $80 million for majority stakes. No seizure, no storming of gates, just paperwork and a signal. Because what came next wasn't just about mines. It was about where that gold would finally go. By mid-2025, Burkina Faso inaugurated its 4th domestic gold refinery in partnership with Marina Gold. On the surface, this sounds like a footnote, but consider this. Until recently, most gold mined in the country was refined in Switzerland, then sold on global markets, often with Burkina's name nowhere in the paperwork. Now, the value chain is starting to close, and the job chain is opening. Hundreds of workers, engineers, technicians, metal workers, have been hired, not just to extract, but to transform. It's the difference between selling oranges and selling juice. And if you're American, you probably get that logic. Processing means margins. Margins mean leverage. Still, there's a quiet contradiction. The refinery is local, yes, but the processing equipment? Imported. The refining chemicals? Sourced abroad. The certification? Still done in Europe. So, is this sovereignty or just proximity? That question lingers, especially when people remember what happened in other African countries that tried to do the same. Nationalize too fast, and capital flees. Move too slow, and extraction continues. So far, Traore has played the in-between, confrontational in tone, contractual in execution. But beneath the policy is something harder to measure, the emotional shift. Ask an older miner in Gawa, and he might shrug. It's still gold, still hard work, still dust. But ask his son, who just enrolled in metallurgy training, and you'll hear something else. Not hope, exactly, but clarity. When you know that what you dig stays here, that it builds clinics, not condos abroad, your sweat hits the ground differently. It doesn't disappear. It recirculates. There's a reason why studies on worker morale consistently link pride to purpose, not just pay. People don't need fairy tales, but they do need to feel the effort means something beyond export statistics. And maybe that's the real gold rush happening now. Not in the soil, but in the psychology. A shift from extraction to ownership, from being used to being useful. Which raises another question, quietly but persistently. When people finally see the value of what they've always held, what else will they stop giving away? In Burkina Faso, the poorest citizens now have something most wealthy democracies still struggle to deliver: a national bank built specifically for them. It sounds backwards, but in late 24, while major economies debated digital currencies and banking regulations, Burkina Faso opened PostBank, a public financial institution with one mission: serve the people. Traditional banks ignored for generations. The launch wasn't flashy. No ticker bell, no champagne. Just a building in Ouagadougou, a 15 billion CFA investment, and a quiet promise: small-scale farmers, women entrepreneurs, rural traders. Your money matters now. This is where the twist starts to show. Most financial institutions in West Africa operate like distant fortresses: high fees, complex forms, urban-only branches. PostBank flipped that model. It opened satellite services through rural post offices, offered microloans without the usual bureaucracy, created savings accounts that don't require smartphones. It's banking, redefined through necessity. But the real story isn't the tech, it's the shift in trust. A woman in Tenkodogo can now borrow to launch a tailoring shop. A farmer near Kaya doesn't need to sell his land to afford new seeds. These aren't just transactions, they're behavioral shifts. Because when access meets agency, people start planning beyond the week. They start imagining a year ahead. Then, 5. And if you've ever studied economic mobility, or just lived through a recession, you know, the hardest part isn't earning. It's imagining that what you earn can grow. Still, money means little without health. And for most of Burkina Faso's history, healthcare meant travel, to the capital, to the border, or to prayer. That too is changing. In Bobo Dioulasso, construction began on the country's first geriatric hospital, 1.7 billion CFA. Dedicated to elder care, fully state-funded. For a population whose life expectancy is finally beginning to rise, this isn't just overdue, it's symbolic. More quietly, 55 rural clinics were rolled out, 5 new intensive care units. Mobile health vans reach villages where hospitals will take years to build. None of this grabs headlines. But for a mother who doesn't have to walk 12 miles to vaccinate her child, it's everything. And again, the twist. Medical equipment often comes from abroad. Some clinics run on diesel generators. Doctors still leave for better pay in Côte d'Ivoire or France. So no, the system isn't perfect. But the intent is now visible. There's a difference between a promise and a pattern. One is hopeful. The other builds habit. And habits are sticky. Americans often view healthcare as a commodity, negotiated through premiums, plans, and paperwork. But in systems where care is scarce, the first sign of reliability can feel revolutionary. You show up once, you're treated with dignity. You come back. You trust. You tell someone. Which is maybe why what's unfolding in Burkina Faso matters more than the statistics suggest. It's not just about medicine or money. It's about restoring predictability, the quiet expectation that tomorrow will offer something you can count on. And when that kind of consistency arrives in places used to chaos, people don't just survive. They start to show up differently. Stronger, less afraid to ask, more willing to build. Some might say it's small progress, but if you ask the nurse prepping her first shift in a rural clinic, or the elder receiving a free checkup for the first time in her life, progress doesn't feel small at all, especially when the lights stay on. Burkina Faso now manufactures its own electric vehicle, and the first public driver wasn't a politician or a billionaire, but a university student. That shouldn't be possible. But in early 2025, it happened. The vehicle, designed and assembled entirely on Burkinabe soil, can run 330 kilometers per charge and fully recharge in just 30 minutes. It's equipped with GPS, Bluetooth, and solar integration. And while it's not rolling off production lines at Tesla scale, it exists, and that alone shifts the narrative. Because for most of the continent, mobility has meant dependency, imported vehicles, second-hand parts, fuel costs tied to foreign ports. Even public transportation in many cities is run with buses older than the average rider. So the idea of a homegrown, solar-ready EV sounds more like a TED Talk than a real product. Yet here it is, humming down streets that once echoed with generator noise. Still, beneath that success is a quieter question. The battery cells are imported, the software coded in partnership with external firms. Some say the vehicle is only assembled in Burkina, not fully made there. But maybe that's missing the point, because every country begins somewhere. And sometimes, assembly is autonomy, especially when it's the first step out of decades of mechanical silence. That same logic is now reshaping the textile sector. Burkina Faso once relied almost entirely on second-hand clothing imports, leftover fashion, donated or dumped, mostly from Western nations. Walk through any market, and you'd find shirts with faded logos from schools in Ohio, companies in Texas, charity runs in Canada. But in 2025, the country began replacing those piles of mismatched imports with something else, its own identity. Uniforms for police, judges, and public workers are now being stitched from Faso d'Anfani, a traditional hand-woven cloth with deep cultural roots. What used to be reserved for ceremonies is now seen on courtroom benches and street patrols. It's a visual shift, but also a social one. Wearing something made locally, designed with purpose, rooted in story, changes how a person carries themselves. It sounds minor until you realize how often dignity begins with the body, what we wear, how we stand, how we're seen. And while it's easy to overlook, researchers in behavioral economics have consistently shown that symbols of inclusion, even as simple as uniforms, can boost morale, compliance, and long-term commitment to public roles. In other words, when you dress like you belong, you start acting like you do. Of course, this renaissance isn't without contradiction. Many of the sewing machines were imported. Dye chemicals still come from abroad, and local fashion producers face pressure to keep prices low in markets saturated by ultra-cheap foreign garments. But again, what's emerging isn't perfection, it's posture. An engineer fine-tuning EV battery placement in Waga 2000, a tailor in bobo matching rank to fabric, a schoolchild putting on a uniform made by someone in their own city. These are not isolated wins. They're adjustments in national muscle memory, small but coordinated, local but loud. And in a world where identity is often outsourced, the decision to wear your own colors and drive your own car begins to matter more than most people think. Even if the roads aren't all paved yet, Burkina Faso signed a nuclear energy deal with Russia and didn't ask France for permission. That, in itself, is a shift more powerful than any reactor. Most observers assumed it was symbolic. After all, this is a country where many towns still lose power at sunset. But buried in that contrast is exactly why it matters. If you've lived through blackout as routine, energy becomes more than a service. It becomes a statement. In June 2025, at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the Traore administration formalized a cooperation framework with Rosatom, Russia's state-owned nuclear agency. Training, infrastructure, regulation, all under discussion. It's not a plant yet, but it's a path. And in energy diplomacy, direction is often louder than capacity. Critics called it reckless. Others called it performative. But perhaps they're missing a deeper layer. For decades, Burkina Faso depended on fragile energy imports from neighboring states, lines easily disrupted by weather, conflict, or politics. Local grids reached only about 22% of the population. In some rural areas, a working light bulb still feels like a luxury. So why not aim high? Especially when the status quo has kept things low. Still, even as nuclear headlines grab attention, solar has been doing the quiet lifting. The Zagtuli solar plant, launched in 2017, produces over 56 gigawatt-hours per year. A new solar station in Zina, completed in 2020, adds 26 megawatts more. And across the country, small-scale solar grids are lighting clinics, schools, and markets, often with panels installed by local teams trained in-country. That shift, from dependency to distributed control, may not look dramatic. But it is. Because according to multiple studies on energy access, consistent electricity is directly linked to literacy growth, women's employment, and youth retention in rural areas. And more than that, it alters rhythm. When the lights stay on, schedules change. Risk tolerance shifts. People start planning beyond daylight, which leads to something that's harder to calculate but easy to feel: a recalibration of what's possible. Americans often assume progress moves in straight lines, from coal to renewables, from highways to hyperloops. But in places where infrastructure was never really built in the first place, that progression doesn't apply. Here, every advancement is also a correction. In 2025, Burkina Faso didn't just invest in production, it invested in storage. A new oil terminal acquisition in Ghana added 104,000 cubic meters of fuel storage. That's not glamorous, but it's strategic. It means less volatility, fewer shutdowns, more stability. And while nuclear is still years away, it's already doing something that's hard to reverse. It's shifting expectations. Engineers are being trained. Students are asking new questions. A generation is being shown that they don't have to wait for development to arrive. They can design it. Of course, reality is messier. There are still outages, still diesel backups, still compromises. But when a child can study past 6 p.m., when a seamstress can finish a shirt after sunset, when a clinic can refrigerate vaccines without hoping the power holds, it no longer matters where the power comes from. It matters that it's there. And when people stop fearing the dark, they begin reaching further. Quietly, consistently, unapologetically. Burkina Faso was never supposed to matter this much. That's what makes this moment so uncomfortable and so compelling. A country once known more for its coups than its currency is now building refineries, rewriting food policy, launching aircraft, and negotiating nuclear deals. Not because it's rich, not because it's ready, but because it's done waiting. Some call it risky, others call it romantic. But maybe it's just necessary. Because when systems fail for long enough, eventually people stop trying to fix them and start building outside them. That's not rebellion. That's logic. We've shown you projects, planes, plants, policies. But behind each of them is something more human, the shift from asking for help to deciding what help looks like. And that decision ripples. A tailor who no longer needs a middleman. A student who doesn't have to leave the country to believe in their future. A grandmother who walks into a clinic and is seen, not shuffled. These aren't just development indicators. They're reminders that sovereignty isn't about slogans. It's about systems. It's not loud. It's consistent. And maybe that's what's most disruptive. Not the headlines, but the habits changing under them. So, let's end with a question. Not will it work, because no one knows that yet. But maybe a better one. What happens when enough people stop asking permission and simply begin? If you've followed this far, let us know. What moment in this story stuck with you most? Drop it in the comments. And if you felt something shift, even just a little, like this video, share it. Subscribe to Legends by the Rivers. This isn't about Burkina Faso, not really. It's about every place that's been overlooked. Until it wasn't.